My name's Paige. I'm a software developer, and I work professionally and remotely as a full stack developer for financial software institution. So I'm doing these sessions every other week, and we're gonna all try to kind of work together to learn about coding.
That's great, Paige. It's really great to have you here. So I'm Celeste, and I work in Ives Square, and I'm been watching the chat and Facebook. So if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Let me share my screen. So can everyone see my screen? I'm not sure if it's sharing. Is it sharing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
okay, cool. Great, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to be working in this website called codepen.io. You can get here if you just type in codepen.io. You'll come up with like a button on the left that says like start coding. That's how I got here. If I go back, we can kind of see that. Yeah, so you'll just get here and then you click start coding. So we're working in JavaScript today. I'm going to introduce a couple of concepts, a couple of basic sort of concepts in JavaScript, but also in general programming concepts that I think are valuable to kind of like give you context for some of the things that we're trying to like achieve when we write a program. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this HTML and minimize this CSS editor because we're not going to need those. We're just going to be working in JavaScript. So I'm going to close that, and then I'm going to click the console here. The console is going to be where we're like going to observe like a lot of the output for what we're doing and what we're like working on. I'm going to start us out by introducing some documentation. Documentation comes up a lot when you write code. In particular, I wanted to, if you've been in or if you watched my sessions before, I constantly reference the Mdn Web Docs by Mozilla, which is the developers of Firefox browser. So it's a browser I'm using right now. This is a really great resource for finding pretty much anything you would need documentation-wise about the web. So it's very searchable. Once you get to the site, just going to developer.mozilla.org, you can pretty much just search whatever you think you'd need to learn about JavaScript, HTML, CSS. So it's pretty navigable. I wanted to start with this documentation page because it's going to introduce a concept to us. If you're new to working with JavaScript or you're new to working with programming languages, this is like a core sort of critical concept that kind of comes up as soon as you really start working with code. And this is the idea of a primitive. So they describe it pretty well. It's a primitive value or a primitive data type, which is data that is not an object and has no methods. They describe it pretty well for JavaScript, but I wouldn't say they're describing it really well, generally speaking. So a primitive is really, well, actually they do. If we jump down here, they describe it pretty well. So a primitive value is represented directly at the lowest level of the language implementation. I think they're still is being a little wordy, but essentially what they're saying is like, this is like the simplest form of data that you can work with in like as a language feature or like as like a tool available to you with the language we're using, which is JavaScript. So primitives are going to be some of the simplest pieces of data that we can work with. JavaScript has a variety of primitives available to it. I think it's worth noting that there are some primitives that I'm not going to like talk about, but I'm going to talk about a handful of them here. Namely, I'm not going to talk about symbol, and I'm not going to talk about big int. I will say for big int that big int is just basically a way for JavaScript to afford having like longer numbers. So we're going to introduce or talk briefly about numbers here. So let's actually just make a couple of these to kind of talk about them. So you're going to see me use this keyword let. This is basically JavaScript syntax for creating a variable. So I'm going to say let this be, I guess was the idea behind that. And I'll say, for my number, I'm going to say something, like a pretty conventional number. I'm going to do anything special. And you'll see CodePen will start giving us syntax errors here. These will kind of accumulate as you go because it's going to try to run your code as you write it. That's totally okay. You don't have to worry about always writing it fast enough to be where you don't get any errors, and you can just clear them out. So there's a couple of key things about the statement that will apply to what we're going to learn about with the type I want to address today. But notice a couple of things here. First of all, we use our let keyword. Second of all, this is the name I'm giving to the variable, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of the type of the variable or the primitive, the data type. So whether or not it's one of these. Okay. JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, or it's often called duck typing, or it basically means that at runtime, you do not have to, or rather when the code actually runs is when we figure out what type of data we're dealing with for a variable, not before that time. So it lets us do things like this. So, I've named this number, but I can say something like this. I put it in quotes here. But what this is doing is creating a string. So I can say, I can actually just write out the words, this number. So now I'm using this type here, the string. So it says this number, but it's actually a string. I can do this because this has nothing to do with the type of data I'm working with. It's just an arbitrary name that I've given it. So this string, it may be more appropriate here. And we'll keep our number. So let's create it again. So I'm creating another variable in addition to the one above. And we'll go with a new number. We'll say 22. There's another type that is listed here that I kind of glossed over, but it's undefined. Undefined is kind of a special type in JavaScript. But it's basically, as listed here pretty clearly. So it's automatically assigned to variables that have just been declared, and to arguments for which there are no actual arguments. You don't have to worry about that right away. But essentially, you can see here, they use the var keyword in their example, which is another way we can create variables. We can say var. I'm going to continue using let, but just keep in mind, you can actually use var or this other keyword constant, or const. I'm just going to keep using let for now, but they're saying, var x, and then they're going to print this. This is how you print in JavaScript. So they're going to print this, and they're telling you when you print this, the value of x here, this variable, is undefined. So what does that look like for us? We can do that ourselves. We don't have to take that example's word for it. So if I log this number, I get 22. So it's basically saying put the content of this variable into the console when I say console.log. When I do that, I get the number 22 into the console. So via that example, if I try something else, if I say x, like they did, but I don't have to say x, I can say this undefined thing. it doesn't really matter what we say. So if I put that in there, it's going to give us the word undefined. So literally undefined means in the JavaScript case, like it's not defined. Like there is no definition for the value of this variable. So I mean, there's not really too much more I want to say about that, other than that just introducing you to the type. The last type that I want to cover that's going to be sort of the emphasis of today's session is this other type, which I am going to introduce via another variable creation, is the Boolean. So the Boolean is a type supported in JavaScript. And simply speaking, there's only two possible values for the Boolean. And in fact, if we go to the primitive documentation here, we can click Boolean, and we can see this. There's only two possible values, like I said, and it's a logical data type, and it can only have the values true or false, literally. So I would type true here. And by the way, this is it's complaining because now not only is it not defined, like it's saying here, but it's actually like it doesn't even know what I'm referring to. So it's going to give us errors. So I'm going to actually replace this with Boolean, and then I'm just going to clear this out. Okay, so now we get true showing up in the console. So what does that mean? That means like essentially like it means like a special keyword, true, and JavaScript is going to handle this value and allow you to use this value in a pretty consistent way. And you're going to be able to use it in certain circumstances, but for the most part, you'll be able to think about it as a programmer or as like a, just like a person, like the way you would normally think about it. So if something is true, you are going to be able to like question the value, and you're going to be able to like build logical statements or sentences or like evaluations of the value to figure out whether it's true or not, or if it's the obvious converse, which is false. And so this will update here, and it's going to say false because now using our updated code, it's going to print the same value. So this is the main thing that I wanted to talk about today is this like Booleanness. And one thing that's interesting about having a variable be Boolean is you can represent something in your code like called, like I guess it would be state. So this program, I mean, this is a program that basically builds two variables and then prints the value of one of them. We could use this program, I mean, not incredibly meaningfully, it's just a variable and then it's printed, but we could use this program to convey what's called state. So the state of something would be, its active sort of like representation, or like what it's doing right now, or like, if I am in a certain state, then I'm not in another state. That's kind of an arbitrary way to say it, but I think the distinction is really clear with Booleans, because a Boolean type is one of two values. It's true or it's false. And specifically, if you have a variable that is a Boolean, it is either one of those, but not both. So you can't be true and false at the same time. You can be one or the other. So if it is true, you could say that that's like a state. So it is in a state of truth. And if it's false, it's in a state of being false. So let's try to like think of a way that we could kind of convey this. So so if I had something like, if I gave this variable like a more meaningful name, for like a, I don't know, like kind of like a human idea. So let's say my fridge is open. Okay. and we'll say that this is false. So I can now use this program that I've written to basically tell me the state of this variable by saying is my, well, I have to make it a string, by the way, if I want to print like words. So is my fridge open? Okay, and then what I'll do is I'll print the state here provided by my program. I'll print the contents of this variable. So now all this program does is tell me whether my fridge is open, essentially. So there's like a state that's being represented with this program now. If I change it, all of a sudden now the program changes to say it's true that my fridge is open. Now, I mean, that's not much more complicated than like what we were dealing with before. It's more about like the way we're thinking about the tools that we're using. So we're using this to convey a state. So this program is like stateful in a way. With that, I kind of want to introduce a new operator. I kind of snuck one in when we were first getting started with this one here. So this is an operator. Actually, I snuck a bunch in. Like this is also an operator. This is an operator. But I think these are a little more clear. Like we're all familiar with like the equals sign. It's not something totally novel to us. If I say something equals something else, I might say that these two things are equivalent. It is important to note, though, that with this operator that I snuck in, I'm not saying that my fridge is open, this variable, is equivalent to the keyword true. And by the way, this is a keyword. It's a special word in JavaScript. If I try to say like that, it's not going to know what I'm talking about. It's nothing really that important. This, garbage here, but this keyword is. If I say that this is equivalent to the keyword true, technically speaking, it is now. Like once I get to line 2, that statement, like if I were to say that to you, my fridge is open, is equivalent to the keyword true. If that statement, like if that variable is set to true, then that's true. But really, we're not doing an equivalency or like an equality here. What we're doing is an assignment. So I'm actually using this equal sign to assign the value true to this variable. The reason I want to distinguish that kind of like action is because I want to introduce a new operator, which I'm going to show you here. Okay, so this is the equality operator. So this is the operator I was talking about before. Like, how do I tell if two things are equivalent? This is going to come in handy when we start talking about Booleans. And you'll notice here that we see the keyword that we've already become familiar with, the false keyword, being used with this new equality operator. I also want to point out really quick before it gets confusing, you'll notice here this whole, they're using 0, they're using the number 1. You can also make equality comparisons with strings. You'll recognize these are just strings like we were messing with before, like when I said, this string, and I think I said something like, oops, this number. In JavaScript, you can use what are called single quotes or double quotes to the same effect. So there's no change here. So if I do this versus the other, either way is fine. So if I do this and I say, let's try to like print an equality result. So let's like make an equality comparison, like they're doing in that example here. If I say this string equals, this number, right? So the same string I used previously, I get a true output here. So let's just make that very clear that this is the statement that's giving us the true output that you see like right here, this one. So we'll just add another string like we did below. Are these two strings equal? So yeah, so the answer is like true. They are equal. But what's up with, kind of like this, like using the number 1? Why is that equal to this? Why is 0 equal to false? Well, in JavaScript, there's this other kind of helpful but unhelpful concept that kind of comes along with what I was talking about in the beginning with types being not well defined when you start a program until you run a program, or that is to say when you write a program or set it up versus like when it's actually running. So me not being able to really know what type of data this is, my fridge is open. If I don't give a very clear explicit value right here, by like using these string quotes to indicate that it's a string, or using one of the special kind of Boolean keywords, or maybe even for a number using like an actual number. Doing something other than that, it can be difficult to discern the type of data that I'm working with. So in JavaScript, there's this concept called, and I know I've introduced a bunch of things here, so it sounds like I've introduced the equality operator, and now I'm trying to introduce truthiness, but just bear with me because I'll bring the truthiness kind of back to, let me see if I can move this. Great, okay. So I'm gonna bring this kind of like back to the equality operator. So we already introduced the Boolean keywords true and false. In JavaScript, there's a concept called truthiness and like falsiness. I mean, it extends beyond JavaScript to some extent, but basically, if you use the value in a Boolean context, like it's saying here, so a Boolean context would be like, well, it'd be like this case that we actually just encountered right here. So this is new to us, but we did an example with it. We tried to compare these two strings. This is a Boolean context. So in a Boolean context, I'm making an equivalence. I'm verifying a statement. I'm like conditioning on the outcome of something, or like I'm evaluating whether or not something is true. I'm evaluating. So in this case, what it's saying is like, if you have other types of data, but you want to make a comparison that requires a Boolean evaluation. So essentially, like, if I try to qualify, something like, a string and like a number, JavaScript is going to attempt to resolve them in some way that allows us to make these comparisons. In this case, the comparison, I think, is like pretty clear to comprehend. Like, is this content equal to the number 34? Like, you would think probably not. But we can start to do other things that are a little more complex looking, where when we start to introduce like numbers, or other like sort of terms that are also considered like true. So for example here, and we're going to get to this like if syntax, but if you take a look at just the inside, let's just think about like basically what this page is saying is like all of these statements inside the parentheses, just ignore the left-hand side for a second, like all of the statements inside these parentheses are true. So they're not the same as saying keyword true like this, but if you try to evaluate them, like ask them if they are true, basically. That's maybe a good way to put it. Like if I were to ask this statement, are you true? It would say, yes, I'm true. It doesn't mean that if I compare it to the keyword true, that they're equal. That I think is a really important distinction. So yeah, let's try to put this in perspective with some equality operations as an example. So we know that these aren't equal here, right? So are these two strings equal? We know that came out to be false. What if we do something like log and we say, are these two variables equal? Okay, and we're going to print out two different things. We're going to leave this here, the my fridge is open, but let's try something else. We're going to say my house is cold. I don't know, because that also sounds like it would be true if I left my fridge open. And instead, this time we're going to use the number 1. So we're going to say my fridge is open. My house is cold. Now, again, I'm not trying to build sentences that necessarily make sense, but bear with me. We'll kind of get to that point where we can actually use all of these different things to try and make some sense out of some statements and try to build actual logic. So the main thing that I wanted to point out using this equality operator really is that we can actually make comparisons with values that aren't obviously the same type, but because of the Boolean context, because we're looking for a Boolean result, when we use the equality operator, we can check on things and we can make comparisons and we can force a Boolean result. So this has to evaluate this statement here. So if I say this is it's often called double equals, this variable double equal to this variable, it's saying, hey, I need you to compare with each other, and then I need you to give me a true or a false, as a result. So the result of this, we can even put it this way. If I use my parentheses, if you remember from math, grade school math, you use parentheses to group statements. So we can do the same thing when we write code. This here, right, I'm going to compare it to the keyword true. What I'm going to get is that it's still the keyword true pops out of this. So this is now one statement. And what I'm saying, in effect, is my fridge is open is equal to the value of my house is cold. So here, the keyword true is equal to the number 1. This is just demonstrating that we use the number 1 to kind of mean the same thing as the keyword true in JavaScript. Similarly, if I change this to false and I change this to 0, okay, we get the same output. So are these two variables equal? Yes. The thing I'm trying to demonstrate here is that the result of this comparison, so my fridge is open, double equal, my house is cold. The result of this is a Boolean. That Boolean result happens to be true, which is equal when we try to compare them with this statement. Hopefully that's not too down the road as far as complexity goes, but I think basically what I'm trying to convey is like we can use all different kinds of types and variables, but then we can relate them to each other using these Boolean operations, they're called, like this, or we can use these sentences to coax out of them like a Boolean result, to like a true or a false. So with that, I kind of want to move to the next part here. And I want to see if we can kind of use this stuff to, oh, and by the way, I just wanted to say, with truthiness, there's also falsiness in JavaScript. There's arguably less falsiness, right? So a lot of things can technically be true in JavaScript. But as far as things that are false, pretty limited number of things that can be false. So the keyword false, the number 0, -0. This is a big int, that kind of like type that we ran into earlier. Big int is just a very, very large number. An empty string is also considered false. So if I say is false the same as an empty string, you would get you would get a true there. So if I said, right, well, let's try it. So if I say are these similar or the same? And to be clear, I'm not saying that these things are equal to each other, though it does look like I'm saying that. Really what I'm saying is like, are they both true? Or do they evaluate the same way in a Boolean context? I think that's a little bit harder to like understand, but thankfully, if we're just building simple sentences, we don't have to worry about that yet. Maybe it's something that you can like kind of engage with later on as you start to learn more. But it's not the same as me saying these are the same thing. So don't get confused if you think, well, this is confusing because you're saying that 0 is the same thing as false. They're not the same thing, but rather when you compare them, JavaScript agrees like these are both false. Sometimes truth and like sameness get construed to be identical concepts. And in programming, it's often made very clear that those are not the same thing. When two things are related to each other as being true, it doesn't mean that they're the same thing at all. It just means that they both came out as being true. So in this case, I don't want to say that they're the same. Rather, are these like both false? Maybe is a better way to put it. And I think I wanted to compare an empty string false. So I think that should work. Yeah. So they come out both to be false, and that's really the best way to think about it. When you do this kind of like comparison, but even that, and that's more of a convenience of like language when I say it this way, but I think it's okay to think of it like that. The best way to say it would be like, are these the same Boolean result when I compare them? That's maybe the wordiest, but like most clear, obvious way that doesn't confuse anyone, I think. Yeah, I don't think the equality operator's super necessary yet, but I think it's interesting to learn about, especially when we try to introduce making statements. So we already saw earlier, we started to build some statements. I mean, we're building statements right now. So we're saying like empty string equal to false. But we can start to do other things. And we can build other types of statements. And the statement that I want to introduce off the bat is the if statement, which we kind of saw earlier. So I'm going to reintroduce a Boolean here. I'm just going to say, is my cat outside? And I'm going to clear this. So the if statement, you saw it briefly, like in one of these examples here, yeah, for the truthiness. These if statements are really simple. They're not actually changing what's called program flow, which is like we're not using the if statements to do anything in particular to like change the way our program's running. We're just using them to evaluate the truth of the statement contained in these parentheses. And we can do the same thing in our examples. Is my cat outside? This isn't going to do anything. You know, it says there are some errors. What's wrong? It does say there are errors. Let's just do that and move on. It didn't like the way that, I guess, probably a different syntax would allow me to do that, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. This, in most contexts, you'll see is how you would complete an if statement. In their case, you should be able to do one-line ifs like this. Like you see here, it let me do it, but for some reason it doesn't want me to do it. Maybe it'll let me do it now. Yeah, okay. So I guess I just had to put a semicolon in my case, but all this statement is doing is basically taking the opportunity to evaluate the statement above, and it's evaluating it for truthiness, or like for being truthy. But it's not doing anything with that knowledge. So it's making an evaluation of like the variable content, and then it's like moving on. Like there, you know, the code after this is going to do something. It'd be like console.log, like hi, like it whether or not this is false doesn't change whether this runs. If I change it, it's still going to run. It's still going to run the code that says hi. Nothing like this isn't changing any program flow as it's written right now. So what I'm going to introduce instead is these braces. These braces are most commonly associated with an if statement. I mean, this is if statement syntax in JavaScript. Some languages you don't have braces. Something like Python, the Python language, you don't have braces around your if statements. But in JavaScript, we're going to use this syntax. So if, and then we're going to use these braces here. So opening and closing. Okay. Now you notice here they're using an operation inside. Similarly, they're evaluating the truthiness of it in order to do something following the statement. So let's make an attempt to do something like that. We're using a statement here. We happen to know that this statement is false at the get-go. Like we created the variable, is my cat outside? It's false. So what happens if I move this console.log here? If I move it up inside of this statement here,
it becomes part of the function.
That is, yeah, that is exactly what's happening. I'm basically wrapping up a piece of code inside of these braces, and I'm only executing it as part of like this statement group here, which is going to tell me whether or not I can execute the rest. And in effect, what we're doing is we're actually using a function. We might find that this function looks a bit weird compared to some other functions that we're already familiar with. For instance, like console.log. this is a function too. When I say console.log here, I'm saying log the contents of the string hi, put it in the console. That looks a lot different from this if kind of syntax where I have these braces, but yeah, that's really true. What we're doing is we're adding statements, but I would say that ifs are actually a special case of like a function, and most ifs you encounter, they have their own special sort of like implementation within like a given language as like a feature of it, and they'll behave definitely differently from functions functions that you might create yourself when you're programming. So but that's a good point. Yeah, it definitely is now part of this function. So
I'm sorry if you covered this earlier, but so let is defining a variable or an argument?
Yeah, we went over that, but just like really quick. But yeah, basically it's just creating a variable. So this program's like super simple. It's not even really a formal program. It's more just like consecutive lines of code. They're going to run, sort of serially, like one after the other. They're always going to run in this order. And yeah, what I'm doing here is I'm saying let is my cat outside be a variable, and assign it with the value false.
So you use let in order to define variables.
That's right. Yeah, I can also use, I just talked about this super briefly, but I can also use keyword var, which is just a different way of defining a variable.
Why would you use one or the other?
Yeah, there are some implications for this when you talk about like writing JavaScript in different parts of like a document, like a web document. So if I have one web document that loads some JavaScript, like as part of like a JavaScript file, and then I load another one, anything that is a variable declared with this var, they would be able to like see each other. So I could see the variable that you created with the keyword var, like that would be visible to me when I load the document. And so would all of the others created this way. If I use let, basically the context of the variable, like the variable's life, it's limited just to that JavaScript file. That's kind of the gist of that. There's definitely some more complicated stuff related to like scope and like the life of the variable, where it can be referenced and stuff. But that's kind of basically why there's the distinction. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So I think then so we have a variable. It's set up with the value false. And in this case, what we've done is we've added the code that we had below, which was here. Okay, we're moving it up. So I'm just cutting it and I'm pasting it right here instead. So if you notice, what's happening is like no matter how many times I make modifications to my code here, it's building preview. It's saying at the bottom right here, processing code finished preview. Like there's no output. It did look like there was some output there, but I assure you there is no output. Yeah, so there's no output. Like nothing's going to be in the console. And the reason being is because the sole purpose of an if is to allow us to encapsulate statements, code statements, conditioned on a statement within these parentheses here. This is kind of where everything sort of hopefully comes together for you. The equality operator, the Boolean type, truthiness, falsiness. So we kind of bring all of this stuff together, these concepts, and kind of pull it all to the if statement, we can kind of see how we can start to build programs that do different things based on logic, based on like Boolean statements, in effect. So what I'd like us to do is like, let's try to write a very simple program, just as we have written out so far, that's going to do or print different things conditioned on the value of this variable. So we can get started by just making some of these logging statements a bit more meaningful. So I can say, for instance, if, you know, my cat is outside, right? Or is my cat outside? If this is true, I would want to say, you know, my cat is outside right now. Okay, so this is still not going to print because we haven't updated it. But all of a sudden, if I change this to true, it's now going to print this, and it's going to print it based on the value of this variable. You know, if we wanted to do something, you know, conditioned on whether like both like, I don't know, like two things are true at once, for example, two things are true simultaneously, then what we might do is, or rather not true simultaneously, but what we learned is that they're both like of the same state. So maybe I want to know, like, let's see, how about both of our cats, let's see, we're going to make another variable here. I'm trying to think of example sentences that we can kind of work through, but let's say, is your cat outside? Okay, so what we have the tools for right now, we can't say whether, like with the tools we have, or we actually do have enough tools, but let's first say something similar. So let's try to break down how we can use the tools we've learned about. Let me put it that way. Okay, so the equality operator, the most we can do is say two things, or actually many things, you know, because we can build, you know, a sentence like this. This equals that, and then I can say equal to, sorry, not like equivalent to the other, and I can kind of keep doing this.
Do you have to evaluate the let code before you do the if function?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do, yeah, but it brings up a good point. So if I go ahead and again, I don't even know if I've talked about this really that much, but like these are comments. So this code isn't evaluated. In JavaScript, it's just like ignored because I put these two forward slashes here. So if I comment this out, it's going to freak out. It's like, I don't know what this variable is. I don't know what you're talking about. And I think to your question, if I move it below here, it still doesn't know what I'm talking about. It's very confused because yeah, this does need to happen like serially. So I'm going to move it back. But what we could do, Austin, is we could remove the assignment, and like we observed earlier, so we came across not truthiness rather, but falsiness. We came across our primitive that we learned about, the undefined keyword. This actually happens to be falsy. So what we can't say is this. Okay, and all of a sudden I'm not printing anymore. And sorry, it does kind of look like I'm printing, but let's just go ahead and take the opportunity to change this. So both of our cats are in the same place. So you know, this isn't going to evaluate even though it updated and everything. And that's because undefined is falsy. So if you need to make a Boolean evaluation, of a statement, JavaScript will resolve undefined as being false. Similarly, it will resolve, 0 as false. It will resolve, -0 as false. Obviously, it will resolve false as false. There is a handful of things that we can resolve as false, and we can kind of it'll also resolve null. Null is like a special JavaScript keyword. It'll resolve that as false. So basically, we can use these tools to kind of make statements like this. So I can't say whether like both my cats are outside with equality, right? Because and we can demonstrate that, I think, pretty easily. So is my cat outside? Let's say it's false, and it's your cat outside is true. So let's just try if they're both true, right? So let's ask this question. We'll ask, is my cat outside? Is your cat outside? So what is this really saying? Well, I already kind of gave you the answer. But what I'm really saying here is I'm not saying like, are these, did I do something wrong? It doesn't want to print it. Maybe I have to change it. Yeah, okay, I don't know why I didn't print it. But anyway, so it's going to print this not because like your cat is outside and my cat is outside. It's printing it because we're saying like both of these things are the same. I don't know if your cat is outside or not actually with this statement. It could be outside or it could be inside. But I know that wherever your cat is, like my cat is also there too. That's really what this is saying. So that's why we would want to build statements with something like this. So if I wanted to know whether my state is the same as your state, I would use this equality operator. If I wanted to know whether, and we can demonstrate this is the case, right? So if I make this false, we've already seen that asking it whether it prints something is not necessarily the greatest indicator, because I have to basically edit the file for it to like run again. But it's not going to print anything, and the reason is because true is not true does not compare the same way with false. Like they're not going to compare equally. So this will result in false, and then this code will not run. What we could do is print things like this, right? And just to remind ourselves, like, yeah, just because this code up here doesn't run, doesn't mean that code below it won't. That's also something I want to point out. So my cat is outside. This will run still. Just because the above doesn't, that doesn't mean anything for subsequent statements. So we're kind of expanding our little program here to kind of do more, I guess, ambitious things. But what if we wanted to now, I think, which would be the most sort of the highlight of this knowledge here, is this statement is powerful, but it's pretty simple. We're just making comparisons like this. What if we wanted to write a program that conditioned on the different like states of the cats, whether they're inside or outside, and tried to like relate them to each other? So we can do that with these if statements. We know that if statements like independently don't affect subsequent if statements. Like this if statement has no effect on this one, right? And neither does it affect this one. And it's not going to stop these from working or not. Even if this one, right, like is successful, if we just delete this here, right? Like this one will run, but so will this one. Like it's not going to change that. What we can do is start to say things like this. So we can remove this statement, and we can actually move it into the other if statement. This actually starts to mean more to us because we can start building logical sentences. So, and that's really what this means right now. So what we're saying here is we're saying if my cat is outside, if that's true, all of the subsequent stuff in here will execute. And if this is true, this will execute. So that means we know we have basically what's called compound logic. So we can know whether two things are true or false, not just whether they're this like they're equivalent to each other. Yeah. So this achieves this statement here, but only in the true case, if that makes sense. So like this is the same as this when both our variables are true. So both our cats are in the same place. We can say that right here. When we get to this statement, it's not going to print that right now because this is false. As soon as I flip this to true, however, my cat is outside and your cat is outside. Both of our cats are in the same place. So I think this is like pretty valuable information, and it's a pretty interesting way to like build a program once you start understanding how to like work with these Booleans. We are like at the end of the time, but if anyone has any questions or anything like that, I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, awesome. I think it is.
Yeah, I
pretty
think,
useful.
I mean, it's really great information and content for anything related to, like, I feel like it's the basic to, if you want to start with. Like,
yeah, it's definitely good to like get familiar with this kind of stuff before you move on to like more kind of like yeah,
so
like
if we had to practice, where do you recommend should we go?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. As far as practicing goes, there are like I'm more familiar with like tutorials and stuff like that. So like, again, you know, the Mozilla developer network, they have a really good, so it's like very clear, you know, you would start here, you can like learn web development. And if you go down here, it'll say like JavaScript first steps, where we were learning about stuff. I think it's going to be like in here, JavaScript building. Oh, well, it'd be here. Yeah, making decisions in your code. So like that's, for example, where we were starting to learn about today. We kind of skipped around a little bit, but yeah, so it's going to introduce if statements too. It's going to talk about, yeah, like how we had statements run afterwards. And I think it'll talk about a variety of stuff. So there's this kind of thing, which is more tutorial oriented. And then there's stuff like, for example, like, trying to think of the name of the website. Well, like, oh, well, okay, there's like Khan Academy. They're gonna have like I guess it's also kind of tutorial oriented, like sort of like guides, walkthroughs. But Khan Academy has free stuff that lets you kind of like run through kind of like coding, specifically doing like a variety of different tasks and stuff like that. So they even have like JavaScript sort of like oriented lessons. Yeah, as far as practice, I mean, I like this approach of just sort of going through a tutorial. That's how I myself have like usually done it. And then usually they'll give you, specifically Mozilla will give you like, if you go into the first steps, they'll give you like an assessment each time. So I guess that's like a good way to practice. Yeah, it'll basically.
Yeah, no, now that you mention it, I think, I mean, usually what happen is a programmer will have a problem to solve, and then that's why there's so many tutorials. It's not like
absolutely.
you really practice. I mean, you practice as you learn.
Yeah.
Problem solving. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, the best way to practice is to like relate the problem for yourself. So yeah, if you have a problem and you want to like figure out how to solve the problem, that's a really good way to learn. You got to find your problems first. That is definitely hard to do.
Yeah.
Figure out what problems you have. But I think this is good. You know, I mean, there's some assessments here. There's a lot of good information. This is something like this, definitely going to be much more guided and like going to be, I think, more like assessment heavy, and it'll ask for really specific things, be kind of like interactive. So yeah.
The CodePen website that you were using has like games and stuff on it too.
Oh, I didn't even realize.
If you go to the home page, there's challenges and games.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I did not know that.
Learn and discover. So there's some stuff on there.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, this seems like it could be a really good. They even have stuff that's like more kind of like more advanced, I would say. This is like using tools. Yeah, like specific tools within JavaScript that you can use to do general things. So it's cool. I like that. Yeah, like some APIs here. But they also look pretty, yeah, like pretty basic. I think these could be a really good way to start learning, for sure. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Paige.
I had a question about the like stuff like 0 evaluating to false.
Mm-hmm.
Is that common in other languages, or is that like kind of a JavaScript thing, or
0 or null?
Or 0, null, like it seemed like there's like a whole range of stuff that evaluates to false.
Yes.
That was common in other languages.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. Yeah. So is it isolated, or is this behavior like pretty much just kind of like quirky feature of JavaScript? And you know, is this more common? And you know, what values actually evaluate to false? So to answer that specifically first, yeah, like these are the only things that are going to evaluate to false in JavaScript. It's a pretty specific subset of items. So these are all considered falsy specifically. So to answer the other part, yeah, actually that's where 0 specifically, that's actually where this comes from, is a more fundamental language or an earlier language, but like in the C language and in precursors to C as well. It's just been kind of like a history of the form, so to speak, I guess, or like it's just like a history of sort of programming that 0 and 1 are like true and false. So you can think of it, you probably maybe familiar somewhat with like binary. That's where it comes from. So it's like binary 1 and 0, true, false. That's where this kind of comes from. The falsiness, that comes from this sort of family of languages. It's definitely not unique to JavaScript, but having things beyond 0 and false, yeah, also evaluating to false. There are other languages that do this. Python does this. You know, certainly some other like kind of what are called like high level languages. I know C# does it. I don't know if necessarily maybe like Java does it. I'm not sure, but it's definitely like sort of a common theme.
So there are certain languages where only false and 0 will evaluate to false in Boolean context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in C you don't have Booleans. You just have 0 or 1.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in C++, they introduced Booleans. Yeah. Often, in fact, in C programs, you'll see this thing. It's like be like this. Hopefully we can find an example of it. I definitely like seeing it a lot. Yeah, so they'll do something like this. Yeah, so they'll like, I don't know, people writing C programs will do all these goofy things to like make it act that way. So like, this is like a library called like stdbool.h is like the interface for the library, but the library is like essentially like stdbool. And what it's doing is like it's giving you this like bool like thing, which you can then use in the same way, like true and false. And it basically sets you up so that you can use these like, yeah, this keyword like true. Oh, they misspelled that. That's not a good look. But essentially, it just maps to this value. So 1 and 0. So that you can like sort of get around it in ways in C, but yeah, like you're just using 1 and 0. But there's a lot of cases where people will do that kind of thing to kind of like circumvent that, like the look. But yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I just want to remember everybody that we're gonna have class on the 15th, December 15, and that will be the last class of the year. And we still have office hours, right? Every week?
Yeah.
On Monday, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think actually those will be done a bit sooner. Like no office hours will happen on the 28th. But
yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Right
All
on.
right,
Thanks,
thank you.
Paige. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.